is this a problem, or actually is it something that we don't need to worry about it too much? What do you reckon? And then I'll go to Greg with the same question.
I think at the start of it, I mentioned that I'm more of a Bayesian, and Bayesians don't rely on historical data. Oh, I mean, within reason anyway. And pardon?
Don't worry, ignore him, Gregory, ignore him.
And the second thing is a lot of that historical data is not going to be valid going forward. The second thing is it comes back to the data that you want to be using. Most businesses, especially in the area of risk, have a wealth of existing information that they can get statistics from in the form of defect logs, corrective action reports, all those type of things. Actually, if they're properly classified and quantified, can produce a wealth of information. The general concept of data is a huge problem. And it's a problem that I've never been happy with. One of the things they do in cleaning your data is to guess at what missing value should be. And almost by definition, you're making stuff up. So that's the problem. On the other side, there is a huge new field in generating synthetic data. And that's where I believe things need to go, due to the fact that people have got the concept of bias wrong, where they think it's a social, I don't know, people are actually going out of the way to introduce bias. Bias actually exists in historical data, and you can't just drop sex or race or whatever from your data set and think you're getting away with bias. There's been studies done that have shown that by doing that, what you're doing is relying on bias to give you the answers. So using historical data, apart from missing data, you've also got inbuilt bias. So you're going to get a wrong solution anyway. Whereas the concept now of looking at this AI, which is the same type of concepts they use in generating deep fakes, to generate data. So given a small set of real data, it can then go away. And the thing about it is you can then generate a set of data to meet the biases that you want. Because in the end, bias is like risk. It's something you want. It's just a matter you want to be able to manage it and decide where it fits into your decision making. So yes, generally I agree that data is a big problem, but I believe there's a lot of good data out there. And I believe, as Graham was saying, too many people go out and start with the idea of saying, I've got data, and that they come at it from a data point of view, not a solution point of view. And then you just work backwards from your solution and work out what data you need to get to it. So there you go. Sorry, I didn't really answer that, but
no. It's all good. And I think that the concept of synthetic data, and as well being very well aware of biases within the data sets, etc. And then again, what is it that you're actually setting out to achieve? What is your business model? So actually using some of what Greg was saying earlier on, McDonald's isn't there to serve burgers. McDonald's is a property company, etc. So Greg, just coming back to the data question, any thoughts in terms of quality of data, where you get the data from, can it be trusted, all of that kind of stuff? And then perhaps we'll go to Gabe.
Absolutely, and I was kind of nodding and shaking then. This is a clever group of people. I like this group. I think Gregory is absolutely spot on in what he said at the end. I won't name, but I've come across companies that treat data science projects like they treat billion-dollar waterfall projects. And they'll go, right, first thing we need to generate a lot of data and get all of our data together. And then we need to do, no. There's a reason Agile was invented. And it has to be problem driven. So I was actually reflecting back in Nodes and Links. So our data scientists, they came to me about 3 months ago and they said, Greg, the algorithms that we've developed and the systems we've developed are now busting at the seams for all the data that we're processing. And we're spending 40% of our time doing data engineering as opposed to testing and creating algorithms. So I said, right, well, how do we go about getting rid of this bottleneck? And they said two things. One is we kind of upgrade the systems so they can cope with it, and we bring in a specialist data engineer who can actually structure that data. It turns out there was a third thing as well, Gregory, to your point, like synthetic algorithms. So a number of data scientists actually produced a number of algorithms that read off the network structures and the systematic effects of the schedules we've got, and then we've subsequently produced more project schedules that have ever existed in human history. To do so, you can do a lot with that, but it's problem driven. Like it was, we need to do this task. That task was, I forget exactly which project they were aiming at there. It was a forensic activity, and they were saying, look, this is now a bottleneck to us delivering this value to these customers. We now need to sort this out, as opposed to, we've got a lot of data, let's now find a problem for it to fit in. You just do it in an agile way. And I think that's the major point there. We could go down a long rabbit hole here about different data sets, but I think that if one people take away things from this is that find a problem and then figure out how you solve that problem within 4 hours. And if you can't do it in 4 hours, it's probably too big.
Excellent. So there's a challenge, everyone, because there's almost 4 hours. Well, there's only 3 actually, between the end of this session and the second session that we've got. So Greg has just set us a challenge there. Gabe, coming back to that data question again, how about yourself? What are your thoughts? And then perhaps I'll go to Jane.
So I think one of the major mistakes we make as a species is we equate data with truth. And we treat numbers as if they are reality. In the best case of really well created data sets, they are an approximation of the truth, but they're still not the truth. And in most cases, they're very, very far from the truth because the data sets are inadequate, shall we say. I think one of the major takeaways I'd like people to have from this is thinking about, what am I using this for? What am I using this data for? And how sensitive is that problem to the data? So to go back to swimming pools and using satellite imagery and AI to identify how many swimming pools there are around the world, is that a sensitive question? Does it matter if it's 5% wrong, 10% wrong? If you're talking about questions of life and death, those margins of error are much, much smaller. And so data should be treated with increasing levels of constructive skepticism. So we don't ever want to get to the place where algorithms are making these decisions because they're making them on models of the world, not the actual world. But we as a species love a number. I mean, how many of us have done reports to boards, stick in a couple of graphs, bit of a table, all of a sudden you're discussing at a different level as if these things are true, as opposed to just a graph, pictures and a couple of numbers, which are just squiggles on the page that you've put in. So I thought of this first when I was doing risk management, and there's a specific bias called the anchoring bias, where if you're given a number, everything derives from that number. So when we were doing risk assessments, and last year's numbers were 3 and 5, say for impact and probability, rather than thinking of the risk in U, we go, oh, well, it's not that much different from last year, so it's still a 3 and a 5, regardless of what 3 and 5 actually mean, which is an entirely different conversation. But we do have this very strange relationship with numbers that we need to be aware of.
I think that's brilliant, Gabe. And just to come on to Jane, some of the most boring discussions I've had in, be it risk workshops or at board level, is when people get stuck in that numbers game. So, how likely is this? To be honest, who cares? The real question is, do we need to be doing something? Is my feeling, but that's maybe me being fairly arrogant with regards to this. Jane, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting because my background is actually accountancy, and Gabe, I couldn't agree with you more. you put a set of figures in front of people and they think that that's the truth. And I think that there is perhaps a danger that, we might be going that way as well with more digitization. So if the algorithm comes back and finds something in these imperfect data sets, there's a danger perhaps that firstly, we don't understand how the algorithm really works and the biases that might be within it. But also, are those biases actually really aligned to corporate objectives? So how are we making sure that when we're using artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence, how are we making sure that that's really aligned with what we're trying to achieve in terms of culture and objectives and so on? And yes, I do think there is a danger that we might start looking at, because it's come from machines, that there's a truth in it that's aligned to numbers in a similar way that we treat figures in accountancy, which also are full of estimates and assumptions, I might add. So, we're in this imperfect world. And actually, I think perhaps one of the biggest step forwards for risk management is actually really acknowledging that.
So, yeah, no, exactly. And I think, this is something here, Jane, and I know that he's got his electronic hand up, so I'm going to come to Greg next. But also just to pop into there that, obviously Gabe and myself, we're originally geologists, and quite a lot of geologists move from geology into risk management. Why? Because we are constantly trying to create stories about something that we know very little about. So we will always tell you, yes, there's a really large copper mine right underneath our feet and give me loads of cash, and we'll be able to go and extract that copper in a very sustainable and ethical fashion. Oh, and by the way, you'll make pots of money as well. Gabe, of course, I'm being fairly flippant with regards to that, and I suspect that Deborah will be cringing behind her switched off camera as well. But that's also something, so from an exploration geology perspective, is we always start with that problem statement, which is, okay, hang on a second, we are going through an energy transition at the moment, so we're going to need to build lots and lots and lots of wind turbines and photovoltaic cells. Where is all that material going to come from? Oh, hang on a second, there is a big supply gap in the marketplace, so I'm going to go and work out where I can dig some tungsten, for example, out of the earth, so then saying, okay, right, where can I go for that? And you do all of that before you start collecting any of that data, because the data collection is really expensive. And so creating that business case first is critical for if you're coming at this from a business perspective. The art of exploration is just data collection and a little bit of story spin on top of it, because you never mine anything, you're not producing anything. Your product is the data. So I'm finding this discussion really interesting, and I'm in the danger of hijacking it. So Greg, over to yourself first, and then then Graham, I'm going to come to you with Hossam's question from the chat. So Greg, over to you.
Thank you for that. Gabe and James has something there that kind of triggered me to put my virtual hand up, which now I can lower. There we go. And this is coming from someone who has made their money building a data and tech company. They're right. The data tells lies, and this to me is actually the core concept of like what a co-pilot really is. And I'll give you a perfect example. So a number of years ago, I was contracting a contract in defense, and I was looking at the risk register, and I'm making these numbers up now, but the principle holds. There were 10 risks, one that had exposure of 10 million, and 9 that had exposure of 10 grand. And they put probabilities against them and produced a risk budget of 200 grand. That is bad risk management. That is terrible risk management. Risk management is really about the impact. It's going, okay, well, that one can bankrupt us, so let's get it off our books. I had a mentor that he told me what he called the 4 secrets to business. And I want to tell you the first 2 was 1, don't lose money. 2, maximize the upside as much as possible. And that's where when I talk about these people who will earn the big bucks, that's where they come in. Because they'll go, okay, how do I pass this risk off down to an insurance company, or create an insurance syndicate to hold that risk, or how do I pass that down in an effective way via the supply chain? Because if I can eliminate that, the risk reward curve suddenly changes and I make disproportionate profit, and I can prove that in 2 graphs, and I'm done, and I'm walking out of that office with, 100 grand in my pocket. So that's all I wanted to say. What you said was spot on. I just wanted to put a tangible example to that where I see this going.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Greg. So just then pulling this back to Hossam's question in the chat, and so everyone can see it if you scroll up slightly. And Hossam was asking hang on a second, that is not Hossam's question. There we go. So Hossam's question was with regards to trying to find a problem first, is there a danger that we start becoming really reactive with what we're talking about? And I think more than that, how do you get your organization to believe that you're asking the right questions when they're saying, but the oil price is never going to fall below 50 cents in the dollar, or whatever the case might, sorry, $50, there we go, 50 cents, that would be horrific. Okay, but maybe it will. The oil price is never going to go below that threshold, and actually getting people to buy into that perhaps problem statement or challenge statement first before you then go and do the work. So I guess there's a little bit of cart before the horse or what have you there. So Graham, what do you think?
Just for the record, sir, the oil price has dipped below 50 cents. It actually went negative for a short period of time after the Corona crisis hit. West Texas crude was, they were paying people to take it off their hands. So we've had negative oil prices, so it's been all the way down there. This is a really, really good question. I think comes back to this issue about sort of the whole data first thing, which I think has been happily not very much present today. Usually when we talk about data, I mean, we had a conference in Denmark a couple of weeks ago that was a very similar theme, and there were an awful lot of, start with the data, clean the data, data lakes, data swamps, this, that, and the other, and then a lot of data speak. We have to let the data speak. And it's kind of interesting because I think it comes very much back to Gabe's point about, we just have a lot of notions to this. And we have this idea that data are objective somehow, that data are objective things. And then the opposite to that is, this idea that you go around with all your sort of pre-cooked theories and all your hidden agenda. And then when you have those in your head, even if you're aware of it or not, you tend to go out and find the data that support your theory and ignore the data that disconfirm your theory. And I think it's really important to get away from this idea that data is objective, because however, just the very issue of selecting data reveals a commitment to a pre-commitment to some sort of theory or other. So the data aren't objective, and there's different levels of it. Some people game it on purpose, and some people are unconsciously going through those sort of selection biases, but they're always there, which is why I'm advocating this idea that we start with the problem. Really, you start with a sense of what you're trying to achieve. You have a sense of what are the levers that you have to pull on in order to achieve those things, and then you're having some sort of model of how, when you intervene, when you make a decision and you pull on these levers, how those things sort of propagate through what's in between and affect the objectives you have. And then what you need to go is to go out into the world and find out what data you have in order to support that model. So ideally, you actually have several models and you'd be trying to choose between them, and you'd also be using the data to condition those models with an enormous amount of uncertainty around them. The problem with that, the counter argument to that is a little bit what Hossam was saying, and I'm finally getting to the question now. So he's saying, well, okay, but then you've just given up on the whole objectivity thing. I mean, how do you know that you're not just sort of solving the problems that support your hidden agenda or your fire stamping or those sort of things? And I think it's a very, very valid point. You still have that issue around objectivity. You still have that issue that you're going around with a hammer and every problem's looking like a nail, and how you deal with that. And I think this comes back to Greg's point. I'm pointing at Greg on my screen, like everyone knows where Greg is on my screen. This goes back to Greg's point. He mentioned agile, and I don't necessarily mean agile TM, the sort of thing that's out there. I just mean a sort of iterative approach. So what you do is you sketch the problem, you sketch the model, you go out and you see what there is in data, and then it's a dialogue. So instead of sort of being driven by data, you have a dialogue with data. So you have your models, which are always provisional. They're always temporary. You're always sort of testing them, trying to confirm them, disconfirm them. And you're always, there's a sort of continual process, iterative process, where you start crude and you're refining as you're going along. And in doing that, you will identify new objectives, you'll identify new decisions, and it'll evolve in a fairly organic way. And I think that agility, if you like, that sort of iterative approach is actually a very important part of this.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Graham. Now, during your little spiel just then, both Gabe and Gregory stuck their electronic hands up. I'm going to actually take this as an opportunity just to gradually bring our panel to a conclusion, because we have that many minutes left in total of our time slot, and I need maybe 2 of those just to warn people as to what's coming up in the afternoon. Okay, and I know that we can all do the maths here with regards to that. So, Gabe, final comments from yourself, and then we'll go on to Gregory.
Thanks, Sarah. With regards to not being reactive and remaining proactive, I would point out that every single business exists to solve a problem. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a business. So remember to take a step back and look at that wider corporate purpose, and you'll see it's solving a problem. That's a good place to start.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Gabe. Fantastic. Gregory, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Trine for final comments.
I just elaborate on what Gabe just said. Too much risk management revolves around starting with the risk and trying to find out what we're going to do about it. In the real way that we should be looking at it, which is going back to the original definition of uncertainty and objectives, is you start with the objectives, which is why you're in business, what Gabe was talking about. But all your companies for this year, you will have a whole set of both strategic down to tactical objectives, and that's your starting point. And that is objective almost by definition. So it doesn't matter what your preference is and what you want to play around with. You have a look at each objective, you work out how it can change. And I'm a great one in not using the risk matrix 1, 2, 3 scoring, but using value at risk. So out of each of those objectives, you're going to come up with what the variance can be, which is your value at risk. And from that, you can then prioritize them based on where your business is going to have the most risk or opportunity for improvement. So, by doing that, you are staying on message the whole time.
Awesome. Somebody mentioned VAR. There we go. Value at risk has made it into the discussion. Thank you very much, Gregory. Trine, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Greg.
I would just quickly comment that to both what Gregory said and again echo what Greg said earlier, that I would say the first thing you should do is look at how far you can go actually by just using traditional or classical risk management methods and doing value at risk, doing Bayesian networking modeling, and yeah, that was just all stuff here. And thank
awesome.
You.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. Greg, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Graham.
I can unmute myself. I think I'd just take Gregory's point just like one step further, which is that we're living in much more of a Pareto-based world than a Gaussian-based world. So you can have extreme events happening more frequently, and they happen more frequently because it's more interconnectivity. And I have a biased view on the board because I'm in venture capital, but those are the opportunities. Those are the once in 10-year opportunities. And I'd be having this juggling thing where I say, look, business as usual has this component, and these are our objectives for business as usual. But we also know that the world is going to go up and down and sideways. And here is our plan for that up and down and sideways, because you can do well out of that. You can really do well out of that. And that's the viewpoint that if you have that viewpoint, you wouldn't be sitting there just doing risk registers every day. You'd be thinking differently. And that's what I'd go for.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Greg. Graham, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Jane.
I'm just repeating what everyone else has said, which is very unusual because this, I mean, it's very interesting to sit here and have your sermons preached at you. My normal sermon is that we start with objectives and decisions, and we try to understand the relationships of what's in between. And then I'll go on to talk about how what you need to do is identify not only the drivers of those objectives and how your interventions can influence them causally, but also get those bigger pictures between the relationships between different things, the structural piece, and then we sort of, eventually, and I hardly ever get there, we'll get over into the sort of thing that Greg's talking about, which is these ideas of complexity, these sort of very non-linear systems, and how the sort of interrelation between things, and also the context they're sitting in, the bigger context, and how important that is. And so I just wanted to try and sort of wrap that up a little bit and say, yeah, let's all do that. It's kind of interesting that, because I think a lot of the traditional approach to data analytics, and I would say that Greg's approach to data analytics is untraditional. And I say that with the warmest praise, and I think that's fantastic. I think a lot of the traditional approach to data analysis is very at loggerheads with that approach, because it's so data driven, because it's so it's all this sort of logical positive miracle. We start with data, the data speaks. But I think what we're talking about here is absolutely the way to approach those things, and then to bring in the analytics as we need them and as we can deploy them.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Graham. And Jane, how about your thoughts?
Well, I'm loving this discussion because it really does make it very realistic and practical. And so, I love the idea, but the truth that every business is here to solve a problem that Gabe brought up. And also, what Greg's talking about in terms of, yes, you've got your business as usual, you've got those objectives that you've set in a world that you think is steady, but we don't live in a steady world. So I suppose my little offering would be, I think we need to run more pre-mortems. I love a pre-mortem. A pre-mortem is getting your leaders to sit down and say, okay, company's dead, what made it die? And that's where they start coming up with all these market disruptors. I mean, it's a very negative way of putting it. There is a more positive way of putting this question, obviously. But, that's when people start coming up with these things that are really slightly off the wall, which then comes with a very rich discussion. This is something as well that's not the pre-mortem part, but this sort of tying to objectives and context, and how we work and hone those skills as risk managers and tune into that leadership mindset of making money and maximizing opportunities. And that's what Mark and I are going to be talking about later. So it's been a really great discussion.
Awesome. And thank you very much, Jane, for that segue into, there's more, everybody. There's more. There's another 3 hours worth of this afternoon. But before I go there, a massive thank you and round of applause to all of our speakers and panelists from this morning. So I know that everybody on the attendee side of things, they are all giving you big whoop, whoop, whoops from their side of the cameras. That's absolutely brilliant.